And we're back with Blair Hassler. And for this segment, I thought we'd talk a little bit more about what I kind of wanted the overarching theme of this episode to be, which is Donald Trump and the bull in the china shop, but also necessary volcano that burns down the forest to grow back stronger. There's a large debate around him and around politics. But if you could explain your family background and just a little bit more about where you stand politically to frame, where we like the conversation.
No problem. My parents are both in education. My mom is an education researcher and was the director of an education research institute, a pedagogy institute, for years and years. And my dad was an educator for 35 years, most of it at Leon High School. But I come at things from a very Keynesian angle, where and as such, I'm a big believer in positive externalities and education and the correct kind of spending, even if it's public spending, can really be a boon to an economy or an area, or can do something that even in some situations capitalist markets fail to do. And so that's where I kind of come at things politically, is from that angle.
Okay. Is there any more to that discussion besides your Keynesian economics? Any maybe cultural attitudes? Sorry, I'm just trying to approach it as a more holistic approach.
Okay, I get you.
One of a thought I've been trying to develop about politics is that I think politics is made up of both culture and ideology, and I think in this election cycle we've seen a lot of friction between those who interact with politics fundamentally on an ideological level and those who interact with it fundamentally on a cultural level. If we're looking at this here, I'm saying the Bernie bros and the Trump guys versus the Democrat and Republican centrist establishment think tanks that are worrying that the gospel on high that everyone took their word to be for so long is no longer maybe carrying as much weight, and that people who feel they've been poorly served by these institutions and their inability to be represented by them as opposed to larger business interests. I feel like there's been a lot of tension there, and that's where I would like to start the conversation. So if you'd like to engage with that thought.
Well, I do feel like the populist background of both the Trump side, or the Trump supporters, and the Sanders supporters does indicate a more of a belief in the individual. And I know that seems weird in the Sanders situation, but I truly think that the centrists are top-down kind of population thinkers, which is why you saw our famous statistician be so very wrong, Nate Silver, on election night.
Well, Nate's done his damnedest, and I understand if I was in Nate's position as well, because basically everyone elevated him to a demigod whose numbers could... No, they really did.
If you can take the demi out of it. I mean, people were talking about him as...
No, if you look at the Upshot and the New York Times and Washington Post, they were all taking all the data that was coming out of 538 as the God's honest truth. The problem is, and this is where an argument that I'm somewhat sympathetic to Nate about, is that the argument is that some of the state polls, specifically some of the Midwestern swing state polls, on a state level basis weren't very accurate. But nationally, it wasn't that much off. It was just such a tight race that, blah, 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 blah. We've heard that argument. And it was the interpretation of those numbers by the pundits that was so misleading, where you have the New York Times saying it's almost 100% chance that Hillary's going to win and everyone else.
Certainly.
And then if you looked at the probability of winning on some of those sites on election night, it was, forgive me for engaging in something that I know your people are very familiar with, Schadenfreude, on election night. But as I saw those prediction numbers begin to change, I knew there were people on the other end of computers somewhere pulling their ever-loving hair out.
They had to be. I think it's too much faith in models that had come that had shown themselves to be extremely powerful predictively one time or a couple times, and each election is going to be so fundamentally different in terms of populations that we have such different collection methods for the data that we're gathering that I can't claim to be the person that saw Trump winning. I didn't either. I was totally wrong. But I thought that the collection of the data still is bad enough that you shouldn't have the confidence that everyone had.
Blair, to clarify my position there, I went into the evening thinking it was an even shot. I've generally been an establishment guy, but I've kind of position myself between two worlds, between folks who are really high on Trump and people who are really high on policy depth and, think tank papers. I'm kind of on that end as well. But I also would like to think I understand some of the cultural concerns that I do think are serious and I think did need to be addressed. And I think that is the reason. I hate to be one of those people that this is why we got Trump, but I think it's those kind of cultural pressure release valves. Well, I think it's those cultural pressure relief valves that people had become so dissatisfied with the kind of court language that politicians used with each other, where they basically said, we're going to make you happy, we're going to make you happy, but what they really meant is we're going to make ourselves and our friends happy, and everyone eventually is going to realize that you can use the restroom on someone's back and tell them it's raining, but that's only going to work for so long. I think that has been a lot of the consternation we've seen within the electorate. What you were talking about earlier about how they're fighting the last war, everyone was so impressed with Obama's technical infrastructure and his data gathering machine that they forgot to maybe put as much emphasis on how ridiculously good a candidate he was, how well-spoken, how easy to like. We can argue one way or the other about his ability to deal with Congress or to build relationships and do the hard sausage making that is legislative process, but he was a once-in-a-generation candidate.
He's a Kennedy type.
Yeah. I hope the Republicans get another Reagan that's like him in my lifetime. I think that's maybe something reasonable to hope, but we can get into that conversation later. But I think people read far too much into his data gathering system and far too little into his charisma, into the reasons behind his election. And I think the people hoping that that portions of the electorate that were so easily turned out for Obama were much more difficult to turn out for Hillary, and some of her charisma problems and the lack of energy she developed, especially on the left. I think that was one of the things I kept saying during the election was that, oh man, it feels like all the energy is with Bernie and Trump, and then Hillary is just the second place ice cream cone that you cry into because you didn't,
I think that's an excellent analogy. There was no one on the far left who was excited to vote for Hillary Clinton, and there was no one on the right who was going to vote for Hillary Clinton, and so you were left with such a small group of people that could have voted for her that would be happy. So a lot of people voted for her out of duty, but is that really what is going to get the highest turnout? And no, Democrats fall in love, Republicans fall in line, and the Democrats certainly were not in love, all of them, with Hillary Clinton.
Well, and I think a fundamental question always had to be, and anyone looking at this with realistic eyes had to ask, how able was Hillary going to be to turn out the African American electorate? Bill Clinton
or the youth electorate.
Yeah, or the youth electorate. I mean, these are two sides of. Hillary had an easier time actually turning. If you look at the primaries, her whole ground game was the African American electorate during the primaries,
correct, versus
the young, bougie white people turning out for Bernie. All those kids that go to Oberlin have to vote for someone. Sorry, I try not to be too flippant. But I think that the point I've been trying to get to here is that we're talking about tectonic shifts culturally, I think, with the electorate here. when we talk about data and we talk about campaigns, we're looking at the topography on a battlefield that is, we need to talk about the tectonic plates and the massive cultural currents that are swirling beneath the surface that I think we can all feel right now, where it feels more contentious than it's felt in my lifetime politically.
I agree with that. I think that one of the things that kind of creates this atmosphere is something you hit on in a piece that I saw you do, talking about our immigration percentage population. And I found that to be an extremely valid and useful tool in looking at
why
race
the tensions.
relations.
Yeah, and it's not, I wanted to approach that question. I'm glad someone did watch it. That is a thought that I would like to incorporate into our greater discussion of how, as the percentage of the foreign-born among the populace increases, there's only so many of those folks that a culture can digest, especially, I think, as they become more culturally divergent from the country they are incorporating into. And we can get into conversations about whether
there has to be an expectation of assimilation.
Yeah, and a
to some
reasonable
degree.
one. And
Yes.
I don't want to get into a conversation about, if I say that as these cultures become more different from traditional Western cultures, it becomes more difficult to assimilate them. I understand that a lot of people are going to hear that and say that's racist, when all I'm really trying to ask
It's
here
talking
is,
about heterogeneous populations.
yeah, is it reasonable to expect a country as mixed as ours and as diverse as ours and as huge as ours, with as many different ideas about how they want to govern themselves as ours? There is only so much cultural instability that we can deal with in an effort to bring more people into the population. At some point, especially at a point like we have now, where there's so much cultural tension and so much political tension, I think continuing the large-scale immigration that we've seen, or the policies we've seen for the last 8 years, it would be culturally somewhat dangerous. I know I don't want to throw that word around lightly, but there's a reasonable conversation to be had here that is one of culture and one of, are we going to continue to allow all the segments of the populace that we were told that America was moving away from under the last electorate? We were basically told, it felt like, among much of the white populace, that we're going to fundamentally change the country. We're going to increase immigration levels and basically pull all the levers of power, all the levels of immigration, to demographically marginalize you, whether this be politically, demographically, economically, basically whatever they can do. And
I worry about it from just the simple labor supply angle. Is something that is bothersome for someone from any angle.
Well, and I don't want to engage in conspiracy theories here, but there is an understanding that much of the push for immigration is also a get out the vote effort. Ultimately, it's how many people can we get in through the door before we get a handle on the security on the southern border. How many people can we get into the country and then get ourselves in a situation where 10 or 15 years or 20 years down the road, they eventually get citizenship?
I think if the assumption is coming from anywhere on the left, that the population game is the way to win a permanent majority, instead of actually producing ideas that work. And things that
convince the people that disagree with you. Have the better
will give you a
arguments.
permanent. If you want a permanent liberal majority, in my opinion, that's your route to it. The population game is how many lives are you going to ruin by trying to move that chess piece one move? And that is it's a dangerous idea that you can vastly shift populations in order to secure your power. That's not the way we want to do business, in my opinion.
Well, Blair, we are up against it, going into our second break.